The scent of freshly baked bread once brought people from all over town to Marco's little bakery. But now, the shop stood nearly empty, the warm glow of the oven barely keeping the space alive. Marco, a kind old baker with tired hands, kneaded the last bit of dough on his wooden counter. His apron, once crisp and clean, was now dusted with years of flour and hard work. He glanced over at the old cash register. It rattled when opened, revealing only a few coins. Business had slowed down, and Marco knew deep inside that this might be the last loaf he would ever bake in this shop. With a deep sigh, he shaped the bread, hoping for a miracle, but preparing for the worst. Just outside, a young boy named Daniel stood, staring into the bakery window. His clothes were worn, his hair tousled from the wind, and his stomach rumbled with hunger. His eyes fixated on the warm, golden loaf resting on the counter inside. He took a step closer, pressing his small fingers against the glass, longing for something he couldn't afford. He knew better than to beg. People often looked away or scolded him. But today he felt especially weak, the hunger gnawing at him more than usual. Inside, Marco noticed him. The baker had seen many customers over the years, but something about this boy's longing gaze touched his heart. He wiped his hands on his apron, walked toward the door and called out, "Come in, child. You look cold." Daniel hesitated, unsure, but the warmth in Marco's voice made him step forward, crossing the threshold into the comforting scent of fresh bread. Marco watched as the boy hesitantly stepped inside, his small hands rubbing together for warmth. The baker glanced at the counter, knowing he had only one loaf left. He picked it up, feeling its comforting weight in his hands. "Are you hungry?" Marco asked softly. Daniel nodded, too shy to speak. Without hesitation, Marco carefully wrapped the loaf in brown paper and held it out. "Here, take this. No charge." Daniel's eyes widened in disbelief. "For me?" he whispered. Marco smiled warmly. "Yes, for you. Eat well, child." Daniel clutched the bread to his chest, holding onto it as if it were the most precious thing in the world. His lips quivered, but he said no more. Instead, he turned and ran out the door, the loaf held tightly in his arms. Marco watched him go, a small smile on his face. He had given away his last loaf, but somehow his heart felt lighter than it had in years. As the sun set that evening, Marco cleaned his counters and wiped his hands on his apron. The shop was quiet now, too quiet. There were no customers, no sounds of laughter or conversation. The shelves were empty, and the warm glow that once filled the bakery was fading. He sat down by the counter, staring at the register. He had done what was right, he knew that. But as he looked at the unpaid bills stacked beside him, doubt crept into his heart. The days passed, and things didn't get better. Eventually, with a heavy heart, Marco reached for the wooden sign on the door. He turned it over, and for the first time in decades, the bakery was officially closed. Years passed. The bakery, once full of life, stood empty and covered in dust. Marco, now older, sat on a bench near the marketplace. He watched people pass by, their hands full of bread from other bakeries. Life had moved on, and he was just another face in the crowd. His hands, once strong and skilled, now trembled slightly with age. He wondered if his kindness had made any difference in the world. Had that boy remembered him? Did that single loaf of bread even matter? He sighed, adjusting his worn coat, preparing for another quiet evening alone. As the sun dipped behind the buildings, a man in a tailored suit approached Marco. "Sir?" he said, his voice warm. Marco looked up, squinting in confusion. The man smiled. "Do you remember me?" Marco shook his head slowly. The man chuckled. "Years ago, you gave a small boy your last loaf of bread. That boy was me. My name is Daniel." Marco's breath caught in his throat. He stared at the man, now successful, his eyes filled with gratitude. Daniel knelt beside Marco. "That bread saved me. It gave me hope. I own a restaurant now, and I want you to be part of it. Will you join me?" With trembling hands, Daniel handed Marco a crisp white apron. Marco's eyes welled with tears. For the first time in years, he felt something return purpose. And the next morning, in a new kitchen, Marco baked again. But this time, he wasn't alone. As the years passed, Marco's once quiet bakery had faded into memory, but the kindness he showed to a hungry boy never disappeared. When Daniel returned, successful and grateful, he offered Marco a chance to bake again, reminding him that every small act of generosity has the power to create change. The bread that Marco had given away, in a moment of selflessness, had come back full circle. In that moment, Marco understood that kindness isn't just about the act itself, but the ripple effect it creates in the world. Sometimes, it's the simplest gestures that lead to the greatest transformations.